Hi, welcome to Chapter 8 video lecture. Hope you're having a great week. It's almost spring break. Semester's half over plus. So, good to talk to you again tonight. Chapter 8 has to do with tenant relations and how you get along with your tenants. We have very skimpy landlord-tenant laws in the state of Idaho, so there's not a lot of guidance there, but there are a few things on the books that are helpful to know. And legally, there are some requirements for you as a landlord, in addition to some of the things in the book that are nice to do as a landlord when you want to maintain a tenant. I have posted a link to a pamphlet prepared by the Attorney General's office here in Idaho that gives helpful advice for landlords and tenants and reviews the laws pertaining to rentals in the state of Idaho and gives a list of all the Idaho Code citations. You will need to read through that. It's an easy read because there are some quiz questions that come from that material, and also there will be some questions on the final exam that come from the landlord-tenant pamphlet from the Idaho Attorney General's office. Please let me know if you have any problems accessing that link. It's also available on the AG's office website, and I recommend that you take a look at it. It's updated periodically, and it has a lot of helpful information for you, kind of the basics of getting started as a landlord, and also if you're a tenant, there is some good information there for you as well. The most important thing that I can probably stress to you today, a couple things when you're dealing with tenants. First of all, good tenants are hard to come by, and if you find a good one, it's always nice to try to keep them if you can. The first most important thing that I would recommend to you when you're starting a new relationship with a tenant and you've picked somebody and signed a lease, gotten your lease in writing, had an attorney review it and make sure it has all the necessary terms in it, is that you do a walkthrough and have a very detailed checklist of items that you will want to check again when the tenant moves out. I have seen these anywhere from just a list of items that can be checked with a place for notes to an actual price list attached with what happens if you don't clean the stove properly, for example, and they have to hire somebody to clean the stove. Here's what the charge will be if you leave it dirty when you move out. A real common one, you know those metal reflector pans that go underneath the burner on the stove? Those are always gross, and if you spill food on them and the food gets burned on, you just can't even get them clean. I recommend just going out and buying some new ones before you move out if they're not perfectly clean, because they're going to charge you for them. And as the landlord, you're going to want the next person to have clean pans too. So that's a common one that I often see, and those are what, $5 or $6 a piece. So that's something that's really common. Another common thing is holes in the wall or broken blinds, or the cover off of a light fixture, or the towel bar is hanging down off the wall. Or there are stains on the carpet that are there when you move in. You want to make a note of that on your walkthrough sheet so that it's clear that those were existing at the time the new tenant moved in or when you move in. You want to get all of those things memorialized. Sometimes the landlord will even give you a couple of days after you move in to go around and look for items that you can report on a list, so that there can't be any question when you move out. And you want to get a copy of that list, and you want to make sure that the landlord has signed it and you have signed it, or if you are the landlord, that you have the tenant sign it, so that there's no misunderstanding. Then when the tenant moves out, you have something to go around and say, hey, this was already like this, you don't have to pay for this, but this wasn't like this. Sometimes people even take pictures. That's also a good idea. If you had a screen punched out or a doorknob that didn't work or something like that, these are all things that you want to be sure and have on the list before you start. And if you're the landlord and you see some of those things are not correct, it's always a good idea to get the property in top repair before you rent to somebody, because that way hopefully they will maintain it in the condition they received it. If somebody gets a rundown unit to rent, they're not going to think there's any reason to keep it up because it was not kept up to start with. When you're collecting rent from tenants, the money is the other mission critical thing. You need to be very specific in accounting for the rent you receive, the day you receive it, whether you're doing this for yourself or for another owner that you're working for. And if you are working for an owner, make sure that you transmit that money to them right away. I've had 3 phone calls this month at my office about a particular landlord in the Boise area who is known for taking the security deposit and the first month's rent from the tenants and never sending the rent to the owners of the property. After 2 or 3 months, when they haven't gotten their money, they try and get a hold of him and he doesn't respond, and they can't get the money from him. They take him to court, they get a judgment against him, and he doesn't pay it. And he recently filed bankruptcy, so all of these debts will be discharged. So it's really a good practice to be aware that handling the money is really important, because you're taking care of someone else's property and they're counting on you, and you have a fiduciary duty to them. Really encourage you to keep your books straight. If you can afford to buy some specific property management software, that's great. If you can't, QuickBooks works really well. It's not overly expensive. You can even make an Excel spreadsheet if you only have 1 property or 2, or your own that you're managing. But you want to be very specific in all the expenses and repairs. And if you make a repair because the tenant broke something, that you are able to collect that money. And if you're making repairs for something that just needs to be taken care of, that you're keeping track of all that as well. The exceptions, the book talks a little bit about being flexible if somebody's having a hard time, and remember Steve Fender talked about that in his interview. You must let the owner know if you're going to be flexible, because it must be okay with the owner that you do that. When you're acting for someone else, you can't just do what you think is right, although typically the owner will go along with your recommendation because you're the professional, but you do need to make sure that you're communicating with the owner all the time. The problem you get when people don't pay regularly is that if you let them get away with it, it's good to show mercy. It's hard to know when is the time to be kind of a hard about it, because sometimes people will take advantage and come up with a really plausible sad story, and then pretty soon every month it's a sad story, and now you've gotten yourself into a bad habit of where you're always accepting the money late, and it's harder to get the tenant evicted because you have a practice of letting them pay late, so you haven't enforced the terms of the lease consistently. So just beware of that too. If the tenant does breach the lease in a material way, there are some very specific procedures that you have to follow in order to evict someone. First, you have to give them a notice and give them the opportunity to fix the problem or move out on their own before you can file a court case for eviction. And at that, then you have to go before the judge and get an eviction order. They're typically not difficult to obtain, but there's a specific process that you need to follow. I encourage you to look at the county website of the county where you live and try to find and see if they give you any forms for eviction court. I know most of them have small claims forms, but eviction's a little bit different, and see if they give you any forms. I know a lot of people that go to eviction court end up hiring an attorney because they're a corporation or a limited liability company and they're required to be represented by an attorney. That's a little nuance that we aren't going to get into today, but I've been to a number of eviction court proceedings because here in Ada County they do ask that people mediate or try to work it out without getting a judgment, and I volunteer as a mediator there. So I've seen quite a few of these things, but it's a pretty sad situation. So a lot of it can be avoided by setting good expectations, being choosy about your tenants, checking references as the previous chapter discussed. And I had a good story today from some people that own their own properties, and they had an applicant who they were not really sure about. They were kind of on the fence because he had some things in his past that weren't great. He'd been in jail, and they were just not sure about whether to take a chance on him or not. So they looked at the address, his previous address, and they noticed that it was very near a friend of theirs. And they asked the person, do you know Joe Blow or whatever his name was? And he said, oh yeah, he was my next door neighbor. Please call him and ask him about me. So they did. They called their friend and they said, what do you know about this guy who rented this house? And they just went on and on about how great he was. So they took a chance on him, and he's been one of their tenants for 5 years now, and they love him, and he's a great tenant. So that was a situation where they were able to check references and have that work out. But again, you can look for that eviction judgment. If you have somebody that has a pattern of not paying their bills, and there's a lot of collection cases against them or eviction cases, that person is probably not somebody that's going to be your ideal tenant. Everybody deserves a chance, that's true. But you have to make the judgment call on whether you're willing to take the risk or whether you can afford to be out a couple, 3-4 months of rent money, because a lot of times that's how long it takes before somebody finally gets out and you get the property back suited up for rental. But the tenant can breach the lease, not paying the rent, making extra keys if they're not supposed to, having a pet when they're not supposed to. But the landlord can also breach the lease. There are some implied warranties, is what they're called in the law. And when you sign a lease with someone, they are presumed to have the warranty that they will be able to have quiet enjoyment of their property. That means there isn't going to be construction work going on at all hours of the day and night, or the tenant busting in the door 3 times a day to spy on them, or any number of things like that. And also an implied warranty of habitability, meaning that the property is fit to live in. If the heat goes out and it's February, that's not a habitable apartment, and the tenant doesn't have to continue to pay the rent. You are in breach of the lease as the landlord if you allow that to continue and not have it repaired right away. In fact, there are some things that are mentioned in the Attorney General's pamphlet that a landlord has a responsibility to take care of. Otherwise, the landlord would be in violation of the law. And those are things like making sure that you have sanitary facilities in good order, like toilets and running water and heat. You're required to have an operating heating system, and some other things that would be good for you to review in that pamphlet. There's also a description of what constitutes normal wear and tear and what constitutes damages for the purpose of withholding somebody's security deposit when they move out. One thing other that I want to mention to you about the landlord's obligation to keep a property in good working order. Smoke alarms are required. Carbon monoxide detectors may or may not be required in the law, but always a good idea. I don't know if any of you remember, a couple of years ago there was a situation here in Boise where there was a gas hot water heater in an apartment that was faulty, and there was not a working carbon monoxide detector in the unit. A young man home from the military and his girlfriend fell asleep, and he actually passed away from carbon monoxide poisoning due to that faulty hot water heater. And I am pretty sure there's quite a large lawsuit being filed or has been filed against that property management company for not taking good care of the unit to make sure, first of all, that the hot water heater was properly functioning, and second, that there was a carbon monoxide detector working around those gas appliances. So it was a tragic, tragic story. The young lady survived, and certainly wouldn't wish that on anybody, but that's kind of a worst case scenario of what can happen, and the awesome responsibility that you have as a landlord and also as a tenant. You know, if you're the tenant and you have a tenant and the tenant tells you about something that needs to be fixed, of course you want to fix it right away. If you're the tenant and something's broken, you probably want to tell the landlord right away. He can't fix it if he or she doesn't know it's broken, and if something happens later on and you just didn't tell the landlord, that's kind of on you. I had an interesting discussion today with with a family, a couple, husband and wife, that have some of their own properties that they own and have as rentals, and I'm going to post that interview for you as well. But they were telling me an interesting little tidbit that they have 5 rental properties, and in their houses, they hire a lawn service, and they hire somebody to have the furnace serviced once or twice a year. And they have the lawn service come 4 times a year to apply fertilizer and weed killer and that sort of thing. And they make sure that there's somebody in and out of that house maybe once a month just to, do some maintenance or repair. They don't do any of their own. And the side benefit of that is they've had a relationship with these same people, these same contractors for a lot of years, and they'll come back and say, it looks like there's a dog in that backyard. I see spots where I applied the weed, there's dead spots in the grass, and it looks like there's a dog back there, and I thought you didn't allow pets. Or, go in and check out the furnace, and I smell smoke in there. It smells, somebody's been smoking in that house, and just kind of eyes and ears on the ground for them. And I thought that was kind of clever of them to do that, because they don't want to be there all the time, but they also want to keep their properties in good repair, and so they can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone that way. I appreciate your taking the time to hear the video lecture today. I appreciate your taking the time to read through the Attorney General's pamphlet that I have posted, and also to watch the interview that I'm going to post here shortly for you to get some other perspective on what it's like to be your own landlord and have some rental properties for investment. I wish you have a wonderful week, and we will talk to you again in the near future.